Yes, I was just wondering if anyone knows of this 20 gigabytes of TechLive or whatever it is. Can you say that 10% of it is used by 90% of the people or something like that? My guess is that almost all of it is very rarely used, and there's a hardcore which is sufficient for 95% of all users. And if some statistic like that existed, then you could come up with some sort of, let's call it an official subset or something. And I think it wouldn't be that difficult to run LaTeX. And if it's missing something, print out a message saying, I don't have this file, do you want me to download it from C10 now and put it where it should be and continue, yes or no? And then people would install something, maybe a few hundred megabytes, like TinyTech or something like that. But if it happened that they need some obscure font or some package which is not there, it would be a matter of downloading, probably a few hundred kilobytes or megabytes or something, which could be done interactively. So, you wouldn't be restricted to some sort of prepackaged subset. It would be a subset which could dynamically expand as needed. And I think the bandwidth in the disk space for that would be negligible.
Well, Philip's comments have inspired me to consider an idea that's been developing in my mind. My context is I use TechShop on a Mac, and it occurs to me that because I'm using a script called LaTeX MK, which was contributed to the tech world, that it has a sort of makefile approach to typesetting my job. And one of the things that it can do, because it can talk to the system, it could interface to some sort of TechLive updating or Git-based updating approach to immediately supply those necessary files if they had not been installed. So it's kind of the best of both worlds of having a WYSIWYG interface to tech, but basing it on the Unix shell, which is Mac OS. And then if my experimental Git-based system were actually implemented, it could keep its own statistics, and we could discover answers to questions like Philip was posing about what is a useful minimum distribution and so on. Of course, I understand that a statistical analysis would probably reveal that there's a long tail, but that remains to be seen.
I think there's very definitely a place for the well-judged subset. And indeed, when we take a course at university or at school, we're learning a well-chosen subset of whatever it is we're learning. And that's another way to look at it, which is the author is writing a document. What sort of writing commands does the user want to, is appropriate for the user to use when writing the document? And in a certain sense, there are two sides to the problem. The one is writing the document, and the other is formatting the document. And ideally, we can change the formatting after the document has been written. This is the whole purpose of semantic markup, and it is one of the important routes to accessibility, that the formatting can actually be formatting for screen reader rather than for PDF. I think identifying sort of stakeholders is quite important. One group of stakeholders, of course, are the people that create TechLive. And if their work could be made simpler, one would hope that they would be interested in that. And one of the benefits with Git, although I don't quite know how to realize it, is that you can move files and rearrange files without even touching them. You simply say, this is the new tree I want. And if you can do it the right way, you can create that tree and push it to another repository without having any of the relief files. So you did sort of shuffling around pieces of paper, if you like. One of the things I think is quite a useful exercise would be to produce a subset of TechLive that allows you to create a Beamer presentation. And I think it should be possible to do that in about 50 megabytes, most of which would be fonts. I think sorting out the situation regarding fonts and documents is what they often call the low-hanging fruit. If you could say, these are all the font files, never mind the names, never mind how they're organized. This is the data in every single font file that the tech system knows about. And obviously, you'll have to provide some sort of handle so you know which is which and who calls what which. But it would be essentially, here are all the font files, and in TechLive, such and such, this file is called such and such. And in TechLive, something else is called such and such. And in TechLive, something else again is not even there. So a sort of comprehensive and slowly growing collection of type 1 font files, etc., seems to be something that's quite reasonable and doable, and has the prospect of becoming something that can be factored out. I used the word refactoring when I created this proposal. If we could refactor and say, this is how we deal with all the type 1 fonts. We deal with the type 1 fonts in the following way. All the font data is stored here. All the metric data is stored here. And all the support data you deal with somewhere else. Because the font data and the metric data should be immutable once created, or close to immutable. So that's one thing. Another thing is the documentation. I would like to see a way of sort of putting all the documentation somewhere else, and you can say, give me this distribution. I don't want any of the documentation. I'll get the documentation I want somewhere else, or I don't even need it, because I'm a computer and I don't know how to read documentation. When you ask the cloud to do something, your computer on the cloud doesn't know how to read the documentation. It doesn't have the time or interest to do so either. So there's no point when you build the tech distribution for the cloud computer to typeset your document. There's no need to put the documentation in it in the first place. And in what's called serverless programming, you've got sort of 50 megabytes to do a calculation, which might be processing a spreadsheet, making an accessible document, typesetting a document. And if you can get it down to 50 megabytes, you get big benefits in terms of ease of use, cheapness, and everything else, and also security. If you're running something that's potentially insecure, you want to sort of run it in a virtual machine that's set up just to do that one thing. And then at the end, you throw away the virtual machine and any insecurity that's in it has disappeared. So there's lots of reasons for doing this sort of thing. And I think it's a question of learning from experience what works and what doesn't work, both from a technical point of view and from a social point of view. I have to say that TinyTech is a big success within the R community. And some sort of partnering or mutual supportive relationship with the R community would be very good in that respect, I think. There's another thing, which is the difficulty in trying something new means, I think, that tech development goes considerably slower than it needs to. I mean, with Linux, which is a whole operating system and kernel and so forth, on my desktop PC, I can open up a virtual machine, create a virtual machine, and run a completely different Linux kernel that's completely experimental, and it doesn't trash anything, and it only requires a few hundred megabytes or not that much more of storage to do that. So the idea of a group of people writing and rapidly developing a collection of macros to do something requires something more flexible and agile, I think, than the present TechLive system, because it's this great big thing and you don't want to touch one bit of it in case it breaks another bit. Whereas if you could say, this tech system is like a virtual machine, it only uses this stuff. And similarly, if we want to move to the next version of the TechLive distribution and all the macros and LaTeX and everything else like that, if we could say, oh, well, these are the only files that I use that have changed. If we could say that at least would provide a bit of reassurance. And on a similar vein, the LaTeX people want to extend LaTeX so that it will produce tagged PDFs, which requires changes right in the center of LaTeX and potentially can break something that your document depends upon. So the idea of just having one tech distribution that contains everything won't work. The problem isn't that you've got everything. The problem is to select which to use. And that's what version control is. Version control is keeping every possible file that you need to keep and having a sensible way of selecting the files that you do use, plus a way of creating a new tree. So with Git, making a branch is really cheap. You could make a copy of your tree and change just a few things. And if you set things up right, I don't know that we've got the technology in place to do it correctly at this time and easily at this time. You can do a what's if change on something and see what effect it has on your document without having to copy gigabytes of files. So all of these things, in particular Git, came about after the TechLive model and the CSAN model started. But I've deliberately not spoken much about Git here. What I focused on is the present practice of TechLive and the Tech Collection DVD and how we can improve that. Because people are resistant to change, I know I am. And if half of the change could be brought about through improving existing practice, why don't we do that? I'll stop.